Thanks everyone for coming today. We will be talking about the Kent Immigrant and Refugee Services RFP. It's brought to you by the Department of Community and Human Services at the county. And my name is Libby Brockman. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the RFP lead on this, and I will be walking you through it today. In the chat, feel free to put in your name and organization. I know it's a small group, but we have, let me turn on some subtitles. Forgot about that piece. Let me do that. Actually, Luke, do you mind doing that? Thank you. We have closed captioning for you today, and you can also make the font of the closed captioning a little bit bigger if you want. You can just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then in the settings, you can increase the font. Sometimes it is a little bit small. But feel free to type your questions into the chat. All of the answers to questions that we received today will be posted into a FAQ document on Zoom Grants, as well as a recording in the session for folks who weren't able to join us. So today we will cover and share a little bit more about the American Rescue Plan Act in general and the funding source for this. We'll talk about this particular RFP, eligibility and the funding available, and then we'll close up by talking about how to apply and the details of the timeline. All right, so the American Rescue Plan Act, we call it ARPA for short. This is essentially funding from the federal government that provides additional relief to address the continued impact of the pandemic on our economy, the public's health, state and local governments, individuals and businesses. And last March, oh, not last March anymore, 2 Marches ago, Congress passed this act that provided $350 billion for eligible state, local, territorial, and tribal governments across the United States. And King County received and approved $631 million of these funds for this region. These federal dollars do have significant reporting and documentation requirements. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today focuses on the additional reporting and management of these federal dollars. But awarded programs through this RFP will need to comply with both the federal requirements and the contractual requirements from King County. And here at the county, DCHS has taken many steps to ensure that the activities described and outlined in this RFP do indeed meet ARPA eligibility requirements, but we do want to point out that the eligibility of your particular proposal will be determined at the time of the review. The other thing that the federal government really wants to avoid is duplication of benefits. And so all ARPA grantees will be required not to duplicate benefits. And so what this means here is that you may have a program that is partially funded by these ARPA funds and partially funded by another source, and that's totally fine. The issue just arises if the cumulative amounts of both of those funds exceed the total amount for that given program. And so we can't have a specific program or activity being funded twice over. I'm happy to take more questions about this at the end as well. At DCHS, our overarching and overall goal is to ensure that all people, regardless of who they are and where they live, have the opportunity to thrive with full and equal access to opportunities, power, and resources. And so to that end, the purpose of this request for proposals, this RFP, is to support programs that provide access to healthy food and promote youth development, early learning, and health and wellness to immigrant and refugee communities in Kent. So more specifically, we want to provide culturally and linguistically appropriate social services to immigrant and refugee families, youth and children in Kent who have been impacted by COVID-19 and this pandemic. And our goal is to provide these services by December 31st of this year. And so this means that this award will be for 6 months of funding from July to December. what we are asking in terms of scope of work is for applicants to propose a model program that includes a combination of the following four: culturally and linguistically attuned vaccine and public health education, culturally appropriate food assistance, the distribution of baby essentials like diapers and bottles and formula, and culturally and linguistically competent staff. And when we think about who we want this RFP to serve, we want this RFP and organizations to serve the refugee and immigrant families, youth, and children living in Kent who have been impacted by COVID-19. In terms of who can apply, this RFP is open to nonprofits and community-based organizations, tribes and tribal organizations, public or other governmental agencies. And really, eligible applicants just must meet the following criteria. They must demonstrate an ability to serve immigrant and refugees in Kent. They must demonstrate a commitment to equity and social justice and working with communities most impacted by COVID and institutional and systemic racism. They must also demonstrate an ability to provide services to individuals who identify as low income, BIPOC, and LGBTQIA, disabled, and those who hold identities from other marginalized groups. And lastly, they must have experience. Well, I shouldn't say they must. We're looking for organizations that have experience managing federal funding and reporting requirements. But if an organization does not have previous experience managing federal funding, we will require you to provide a description of how your organization meets and intends to manage federal funds according to the requirements of this contract, should you be awarded an award through this RFP. There is also one additional requirement. There's a current King County executive order relating to a vaccine mandate, and it may require certain workers of the county to be vaccinated. And the thing I want to convey here and that I want people to understand is that by checking the box in our application related to this vaccine mandate, you are not stating that your organization is currently in compliance with the mandate, or that by checking the box, you're even admitting or committing that the mandate applies to your workers. You may get an award and your project or organization may not be subject to the order, but we just needed a way to include something in this process that shows you as a bidder are aware of this obligation and this King County executive order, should you get an award from this RFP and should it apply at some point down the road. We have included a lot more information about this executive order in the RFP, and it is online in the Zoom Grants portal. Now, in terms of funding, there is up to $50,000 available for this RFP, and the application will ask you to submit a budget and a budget narrative and ask you how you specifically plan to use these dollars. And King County intends to make an award to one organization for the totality of this funding, and the program period will be from July 1st of this year to the end of the year, December 31st. And so this means that the award will be for 6 months of funding. In terms of how the funds can be used, because these are federal dollars from the Treasury, the federal government has outlined very specific uses for these funds. And so they are listed here in categories 1 through 5. These funds can be used to cover direct personnel costs for program staff, including salary and taxes and benefits. We'll talk a little bit more about supporting documents like hourly timesheets that would be required if you are billing a line item such as this. The federal funds can also cover what the federal government calls administrative costs, which includes materials, supplies, communications, and travel expenses. Sometimes at the county or within the community, we call these more direct costs, but if an agency does have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, a NICRA, we can use that here, but this number 2 here, where it says administrative costs, is not talking about the indirects that folks often use. And if an organization doesn't have that federally negotiated indirect cost, sometimes folks will use the 10% de minimis for indirects. And the guidance we've received for this RFP and for these ARPA funds is that it would be best to build those indirect costs into your budget as direct costs rather than putting a catch-all 10% line item on your budget. Doing that may require you to provide a lot more calculation and a lot more documentation and backup work. So it would be best to just build those indirect costs that you have into the administrative costs and the other direct costs here for your project. The third item following up on this list that these funds can be used for is outreach. Transportation and access is an eligible expense, and other resources or costs associated with supporting client access to programming. So what you'll find in Zoom Grants is a budget template that we have provided, and it includes these specific categories. So we will ask you to submit a budget and a budget narrative reflecting these buckets. And if you propose a category outside of these on your budget, that's fine, but an eligibility determination will be made by the county before awards are made. In terms of contract and reporting requirements for these federal dollars, funded organizations will be required to submit these forms here that we have, the civil rights certification, the lobbying certification, and a cost certification. Organizations will also need to maintain an active registration with the System for Award Management, sam.gov. All of this is outlined in the RFP, and there's more information there about it. There's additional documentation that will be required and verification paperwork that you have to submit, especially related to finances and the financial management of your project. Organizations will need to show how they manage their finances using GAAP accounting, generally accepted accounting principles. They will have to submit a general ledger and hourly timesheets if billing for personnel and staff time. There is a non-duplication of benefits form that we will have organizations complete. And for all expenses, you will need to provide detailed proof of expenses and proofs of payment and activities and events. So there sometimes can be a considerable more amount of reporting and financial management requirements when it comes to federally funded programs. But if you haven't administered a federally funded grant before, that is not a disqualifier here, but you will need to be able to explain how your agency will manage these reporting requirements successfully. In terms of monitoring and audit requirements, I do want to point out that because these are federally funded dollars, whoops, there we go, they may require an organization to have to submit a single audit. And a single audit is required if an organization receives or expends $750,000 or more of federal funds in a fiscal year. And I know I mentioned before that this grant is distributing $50,000, but should an organization have received $700,000 from other organizations or from other entities of federal funds in this year, this $50,000 would then put that organization at the threshold for having to complete the single audit. And then organizations that do receive federal funds must provide electronic copies of all documentation to the county and retain originals until December 31st, 2032. So that is part of our monitoring and fiscal management. That pretty much ties up a lot of the requirements that we have for this RFP. Now I want to talk to you a little bit more about like the technical components and how to actually apply to this program. The RFP will be hosted in Zoom Grants, and it's an online application and review portal. All RFP materials are posted there, and you can see the RFP guidelines, the federal terms and conditions that I've been mentioning, and you can also check Zoom Grants for updates and announcements between now and the deadline. We will have you submit your application via Zoom Grants, and we will put the link in the chat at the before we end today so that you can take that home with you. And I just do want to let you know that applications are due on May 5th at 2 p.m. Any proposals that are late may not be accepted and may not be scored. So please be sure to get those in by 2 p.m. on the 5th when the Zoom grants link closes. Again, here is that link, but we will put that in the chat for you. If you haven't used Zoom grants before, it's pretty straightforward. It uses a tab system. And so I recommend that you click the blue button for Show Library and download those materials. You don't want to miss anything, but that's where we will upload all guidance and budget templates and things like that. So you will find them there in the library. The other main components of the application is the summary, the pre-application, the narrative questions, and the documents. And the summary application will ask you just for the contact information of your organization. The pre-application tab is where your organization will recognize that King County Executive Vaccine Mandate Order that I mentioned before. And there's a couple other attestations in there that we will have you complete regarding the management of federal funds. And then lastly, the narrative questions in the documents tab, that's really the meat of this proposal. There are some long answer questions in the narratives tab, and in the documents tab, that is where you will upload your budget and your budget narrative. If you have or have not used Zoom grants before, here's just a couple helpful things to know about it. One, your work will autosave, so don't feel like you have to go in and complete the application all at once. You can work on it piecemeal, logging in and out as many times as you need. If you do need further assistance, Zoom Grants U is a knowledge base that is provided by Zoom Grants, and it provides lots of guidance. You can also always click the help button at the top of your application and submit a ticket to Zoom Grants that way. I did mention already that Zoom Grants uses a tab system to help you navigate between the different sections of your application. And there is a check for completion feature that will double check and make sure you've filled out all of the required forms before you hit that submit button. So if you accidentally forget to complete a section, this feature will notify you of that. Now, just to give you a little sense of kind of the process for this, we will have folks submit applications by May 5th at 2 p.m. After that, all applications will be reviewed for eligibility. A review panel will then be gathered and will review and score each application based on these criteria here: the organizational capacity and experience, the program model, their approach to equity and social justice. The budget and fiscal components will be scored, as well as the capacity an organization has to meet federal reporting requirements. And then the data collection and evaluation is the last piece as well. You don't have to write these down. They are all included with a lot more details in the RFP document in Zoom Grants. But essentially, after the review panel scores applications, they will meet. There may be an option or a need to do some interviews if the review panel feels like they might need more questions. These would be scheduled at a mutually convenient time for the organizations and for the county. And then the review panel submits their award recommendations, and the leadership of the department will finalize awards. In terms of the timeline for all of this work, we are here on April 13th. We are having the webinar info session, so we're already at step 2, but please submit all final questions to us by April 28th. That gives us enough time to find the answers for you and get back to you before the deadline for submitting applications on May 5th at 2 p.m. The applications will then all be reviewed in May, and we will conduct interviews then as well if needed. And we hope to notify awardees in the beginning or middle of June, and hopefully get the contract period set so that it starts on July 1st. I would say the most important date on this slide is the May 5th, 2 p.m. deadline. So that is one that you might want to write down. Again, as I mentioned, for any technical support, please contact Zoom Grants directly. You can email them, you can call them, you can submit a help ticket directly. But if you do have questions about the content of this RFP and the particular requirements of it, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm the RFP lead. I will be accepting all questions. And again, the deadline for asking them is April 28th. So we will have some time in just a little bit to answer some more questions, but really your next steps are just to review the RFP and Zoom grants, see if you're interested, and then complete your proposal there and get your application submitted by May 5th at 2 p.m. This slide has my contact information at the bottom. I'm happy to take some questions and answers right now. I will leave the slide up with my contact information while I take questions. And Luke, actually, could you do me a favor and maybe put my email in the chat for folks to copy and paste and save? But I welcome you. I know we have a small group here. Feel free to unmute yourself or to put your questions in the chat, and we can hop into that and help you. Thanks so much for your interest in this RFP.
Thank you very much. No questions at this time, but it's good to know we have your email if we need that in future. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for joining us today. I appreciate it. Excellent. All right. Thank you, Amanda. All right, well, it looks like there are no questions. Folks can feel free to reach out to me via email, but I'm around and happy to help with this. Thanks so much for joining today. Have a great day.